When most people think of comedy, they think of laughter, entertainment, and jokes designed to help people forget about everyday life. But some comedians use humor very differently, using it to challenge ideas, provoke thought, expose hypocrisy, and sometimes shake people awake. One of the most unforgettable voices to ever do that was Bill Hicks. Who was Bill Hicks? Born in 1961 in the American South, William Melvin Hicks grew up moving through places like Florida, Alabama, New Jersey, and finally Houston, Texas, where his identity as a comedian truly began to form. As a teenager, Hicks was already sneaking out at night to perform stand-up comedy. From the beginning, he was different. He was fearless, razor-sharp, brilliantly cynical, and often brutally honest in ways that made audiences laugh while simultaneously making them deeply uncomfortable. His comedy attacked hypocrisy, blind consumerism, corrupt politics, censorship, organized religion, media propaganda, and the strange artificial world modern society seemed to be constructing around itself. He had little patience for falsehood, and he especially hated corporate manipulation disguised as culture. Unlike many comedians chasing approval, Bill Hicks was never interested in safe jokes or easy applause. What he wanted was confrontation, reflection, and honest conversation. And beneath the sarcasm, anger, and dark humor, there was often something deeper, a search for truth, meaning, freedom, and expanded consciousness. The comedian with the philosopher's mind. Bill Hicks once described himself as Noam Chomsky with dick jokes, funny but strangely accurate. What made Hicks unique was his ability to move effortlessly between savage satire and surprisingly spiritual ideas. One moment he was mocking politicians, advertisers, televangelists, and media manipulation. The next, he was talking about love, consciousness, psychedelics, perception, and humanity's forgotten potential. He often challenged the very structure of reality people accepted without question. He talked about awakening, about seeing through the illusion, about how culture programs perception, about how fear keeps people mentally trapped. One of his famous ideas was simple but powerful. Life is just a ride. To Hicks, most people were sleepwalking through systems they never consciously chose, and comedy became his weapon for disrupting that sleep. In many ways, he sounded less like a comedian and more like a philosopher disguised as one, the Outlaw Voice. Bill Hicks belonged to a generation of outlaw comedians inspired by figures like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Lenny Bruce, and Sam Kinison, but Hicks pushed into stranger and more existential territory. He openly discussed taboo subjects most public figures avoided: JFK, media deceptions, UFO, religion, psychedelics, war, corporate propaganda, the manipulation of public consciousness. He distrusted centralized power deeply and often joked that governments only reveal reality in carefully controlled fragments. Even his comedy tours reflected that mindset. At one point, he called his live performances the Flying Saucer Tour, not because he claimed to have answers, but because he loved questioning the boundaries of accepted reality. Whether audiences agreed with him or not, Hicks forced people to think, and that was his real power. Bill Hicks and heavy metal. Bill Hicks also became a strong defender of rock and metal culture during the moral panic of the late 80s and early 90s. At the time, conservative media and religious groups were accusing heavy metal bands of corrupting young people through satanic imagery and hidden subliminal messages. One of the biggest controversies was the Judas Priest trial in 1990, where the band was accused of hiding secret audio messages that supposedly encouraged suicide. Hicks openly mocked the hysteria surrounding the case. To him, the idea that musicians were secretly brainwashing audiences through hidden messages was absurd and, more importantly, dangerous. Because underneath the panic, Hicks saw something deeper. Another attempt to censor art, control culture, and demonize independent thinking. He joked that if musicians truly possessed magical subliminal powers, they probably would have used them to sell more records instead. For many rock and metal fans, Hicks felt like one of the few public voices who genuinely understood the difference between darkness in art and actual evil. The connection to music. Bill Hicks had a deep connection to music culture, especially the darker, more introspective side of alternative rock and progressive metal. Many musicians saw him not simply as a comedian, but as a kind of artistic ally. Radiohead later dedicated an album to him, so did Tool, and a few bands connected with Hicks' worldview more strongly than Tool. Their themes of awakening, questioning authority, expanded consciousness, and breaking mental conditioning mirrored many of the same ideas Hicks explored through comedy. Tool frontman Maynard James Keenan became obsessed with Hicks' stand-up recordings while touring in the early 90s. Maynard later described them as a constant soundtrack on the road. Eventually, the two connected personally and developed a friendship. According to Maynard, we're speaking the same message, but in a different language. That may be the perfect summary of the relationship between Tool and Bill Hicks. Comedy as consciousness hacking, music as consciousness hacking. Different medium, same signal. And if you have music of your own and want it to sound deep enough to open a third eye, or maybe start a conspiracy theory, I offer professional mixing and mastering through my website. The link is in the description. Bill Hicks and Tool. The connection between Bill Hicks and Tool became legendary. Tool listed Hicks as an inspiration in the liner notes of their debut album Undertow. Hicks later opened for the band live during the final stop of the Undertow tour in 1993. At one performance, Hicks walked on stage and casually announced that he had lost one of his contact lenses in the mosh pit. The audience immediately dropped to the floor, searching for it. It became one of those absurd little Bill Hicks moments fans still remember decades later. Soon after, Tool and Hicks seriously discussed creating a combined comedy and progressive rock tour together. The idea was radical for the time. A stand-up philosopher comic performing alongside one of the strangest and most psychologically intense bands of the 1990s. Then something changed. Hicks suddenly became hesitant about future plans. Maynard later discovered the reason. Bill Hicks had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Despite chemotherapy and worsening health, Hicks continued touring and performing as long as his body allowed. He even joked on stage while dying. But in February 1994, at only 32 years old, Bill Hicks died before the tour with Tool could ever happen. Tool, Third Eye, and Immortality. After Hicks' death, Tool immortalized him inside their mythology. Their 1996 album Anima was dedicated to him. The band sampled Hicks directly on the song Third Eye, where his voice talks about psychedelics, consciousness, and perception, before the music explodes in one of Tool's most intense spiritual journeys. His influence can also be felt through songs like Anima, inspired partly by Hicks' famous Arizona Bay routine about California falling into the ocean. Originally, Tool even considered using artwork featuring Maynard being operated on by Bill Hicks. For many fans, Hicks feels spiritually bended inside Tool's artistic DNA, not simply as an influence, almost like a ghost haunting the edges of the band's mythology. The strange theory. And then there is one especially strange conspiracy theory that still refuses to disappear. Some people jokingly, and others surprisingly seriously, suggest that Bill Hicks never really died in 1994, but instead re-emerged years later as Alex Jones. The theory points to similarities in voice, intensity, facial structure, Texas roots, cadence, and anti-establishment rhetoric. Most people dismiss it as internet mythology. Others see the coincidences as strangely compelling. Either way, the theory has become part of modern conspiracy culture, existing somewhere between satire, synchronicity, and genuine speculation. And honestly, the existence of that theory itself feels very Bill Hicks. Conclusion. Was Bill Hicks simply a fearless comedian with sharp political humor and uncompromising honesty? Or was he something more? A philosopher jester, a cultural dissident, a psychedelic satirist, a truth teller disguised as a stand-up comic, someone trying to wake people up through laughter, discomfort, confrontation, and absurdity. That question still lingers. But one thing is clear, his influence stretches far beyond comedy, reaching into music, philosophy, counterculture, and the minds of people still questioning the systems around them. And once you really start listening closely, it becomes difficult to ignore what Bill Hicks was trying to say. He was not just trying to make people laugh, he was trying to make people see